Well, the future of Australia's most expensive and expansive security agreement is under a cloud this morning, with the Pentagon undertaking a review of the Aukus defence agreement.
Even to call it into question in the form of a review is a bad signal of the ultimate intention.
Now, that doesn't mean that the US will cancel AUKUS, but I do think they are going to look very closely at what is termed the optimal pathway for AUKUS.
It started as a landmark security pact. Now it's at a crossroads. AUKUS, the alliance between Australia, the UK and the US, was meant to reshape the balance of power in the Asia-Pacific. Submarines, advanced tech and a united front against rising threats. But behind the bold headlines, cracks are starting to show. Rising tensions, political shake-ups and now rumblings from Washington about hitting pause. So what went wrong and what does the future hold for this high-stakes alliance? Hello, I'm Rebecca Jones and welcome to the Bloomberg Australia podcast. This week I'm joined by Bloomberg's resident Canberra expert Ben Westcott to break down just what we know about this review, what is at stake for Australia and why, ultimately, it's about more than just submarines. Ben, welcome back to the podcast. Before we break into AUKUS, congratulations are in order. You've just got a new job. Tell me about it.
Thanks very much, Beck. Yes, no, I'm starting as Bloomberg's Asia agriculture reporter from today, more or less. So, yes, it's exciting to have a whole new role to jump into. And
what is the best part about this new job, Ben?
Well, of course, it's moving to the great city of Melbourne. Nothing wrong with my home city of Canberra, but Melbourne's a wonderful place, and I'm looking forward to being there soon.
Hurrah, and we will welcome you warmly when you move down next month. For this week, we're talking AUKUS. So I think a good place for us to start is for those listeners who may not be, like you and I, following every twist and turn, is to have a look at exactly what this AUKUS pact is and how it's evolved.
Sure, absolutely. So AUKUS is broken into two pillars. This was an agreement that was struck in 2021 between then President Joe Biden, Australia's Scott Morrison, and UK's Boris Johnson. Now, in every one of those cases, those leaders are now gone. So we're in an era of a whole new section of leaders who are trying to implement a pact they didn't originally agree to. Now, of those two pillars, the first one is the one that gets the most attention. That's the one where the US and the UK will work with Australia to help Canberra field a fleet of nuclear-powered submarines. Sometime in the early 2030s. Initially, it will be a fleet of US Virginia-class submarines that Australia will purchase. And then the UK, Australia and the US will collaborate on putting together a fleet of newly designed submarines known as the SSN AUKUS that the UK and the US will build separately. And that will be a new design for all three nations. Now, as I said at the start, this has now gone through multiple leaders in all these countries. And in Australia and the UK, it seems to have survived more or less intact. The big question, however, was whether or not Donald Trump would be on board with it. He hasn't really spoken publicly about AUKUS very much. So the big question was, would he support continuing the pact into his second term in office?
And did this recent US review catch Australia off guard, Ben?
Well, it's hard to say because the Australians say they've known about it for some time. Deputy Prime Minister and Defence Minister Richard Marles insists that he's been in the loop for a long time. But there's no doubt that certainly when it hit the public sphere, it hit it like a nuclear-powered submarine running through something in the ocean. It was a real bombshell because it highlighted the potential for AUKUS to not be delivered in its current form, something that would be a major problem for Australia and a major vindication for its many critics across the country.
I want to check on that, though, because the UK has also recently conducted a review and decided that they wanted to continue with the deal, and noting too that both the House Republicans in the US and the Democrats signalled their support for AUKUS just last week. It does beg the question, though, Ben, is the US seriously reconsidering its commitment to this pact?
Well, it really depends on who you ask. So some people point to the fact that the main author of this review has long been anti-AUKUS, been a big critic of the pact, and that therefore that's something that people should take quite seriously. He has sway in the US administration. He is a member of Trump's team, and therefore this is something that people should look on quite significantly. On the other hand, there's the fact that this has not come from Trump himself, or even really from Hegseth. This is that's Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth. This has come from not the Secretary of Defense, certainly not the president, and really in the Trump administration, the person who has the last say on most of these big decisions is Donald Trump. So given that, it's really until he says something one way or another in public, a lot of people won't know how seriously to take this review.
And we don't know this week as well, because he was due to meet with Albanese, and that never eventuated. Ben, what do we know about the Australian government's reaction to this review? Is there a sense of concern coming out of Canberra about what this might mean for us, and more so for China's presence in the region too?
I think there are a few parts to that. So I think there will be more concern now for the fans of AUKUS than there was before, since Australia's Prime Minister was unable to get an initial meeting with Donald Trump during the G7. The fact that he was not able to make that AUKUS case face-to-face to Trump, the best way to get a message across to the US president, means that, those doubts over whether or not it's supported by Trump will continue to play across the minds of Australians for some time. But on the other hand, there's going to be, it's not a massive secret. There are people in the Labor government who are not the biggest fans of AUKUS and probably wouldn't mind a chance to walk away for it if they could find a convincing argument. It's a lot of money. It's a lot of uncertainty. And I'm sure that there will be people behind the scenes who will be increasingly making the argument that this is all just too much for the government to be betting Australia's defence on.
So if the US government does decide that it wants to delay or in fact pulls back from the pact, what would be the cost to Australia in terms of, status for one, but also money? What is the ramifications there?
There would be some questions raised, particularly in terms of money, given the fact that our Deputy Prime Minister, Richard Marles, travelled to the US and handed over a cheque for $500 million earlier this year to help improve US infrastructure to speed up the delivery of the Virginia-class submarines that Australia was hoping to buy. Now, if Australia is not getting those submarines, there will be some questions about why we just gave the US $500 million. So whether or not we'd ask for that back, or whether or not we would consider it an investment in a close US ally, who can say? But in terms of status, mostly the biggest question would be in terms of our military preparedness. If the US blows a hole through the AUKUS submarine deal, it blows a hole through all of Australia's military planning for the last 4 years. Australia has really started to remodel its whole military around AUKUS. It started to move away from conventional military forces like land attack groups and move towards long-range capabilities like drones, like missiles, all designed to support this submarine fleet. We've spent money building up infrastructure capabilities. We're looking into improving port infrastructure. We've even been training Australian sailors pilot nuclear submarines. So if all that has been effectively for nothing, and Australia is just left with a fleet of aging Collins-class submarines, there's going to be some big questions around what's next, particularly as Richard Marles sort of said this week, there isn't really a plan B.
Back to the drawing board. And when we come back, what does America first likely mean for US allies around the Asia-Pacific region? You're listening to the Bloomberg Australia podcast. Welcome back to the Bloomberg Australia podcast. You're here with me, Rebecca Jones, and I'm speaking with reporter Ben Westcott about the US review of the AUKUS Pact and what it could mean for Australia's defence future. Ben, as I alluded in the introduction, it is not just about subs, is it? The US Defence Secretary Pete Hegseth has already been ruffling feathers in this region, pushing countries to significantly boost their defence spending across the board. Is it a sign that Australia's role in the Asia-Pacific is changing, or is it just that Washington's priorities are shifting?
So in the release that sort of announced this review of AUKUS, there was a little bit of a reference to these calls from America for its allies to increase military spending on their own defence, which many took to be essentially a slight jab at Australia for refusing to increase its defence spending by as much as Hegseth and the Trump administration were hoping for. So just to put some numbers to it, at his Shangri-La speech, Pete Hegseth called for all of America's allies to increase their defence spending to as much as 5% of GDP. And in a specific meeting with Richard Marles, Australia's defence minister, he said that he wanted to see spending in Australia grow to 3.5% of GDP. Now, we're nowhere near that. At this point, the government is looking to increase defence spending to 2.4% of GDP by the mid-2030s, so a long way away from that. And if we were to increase spending to 3.5% of GDP, that would be tens of billions of dollars that we would have to find from somewhere to pay for capabilities that we haven't quite decided what they would be yet. And that wouldn't even solve the massive military retention problem that Australia and many other militaries around the world have. So in that sense, a lot of people were very quick to draw a line between the news of this AUKUS review and the fact that Australia is refusing to spend so far the amount of money that the US wants on its own military preparedness. Now, is there a clear link between that? It's hard to sort of say at this stage. And there's no doubt that, Australia is paying its way when it comes to AUKUS. It's, as I said before, it's already chipped in $500 million into US industrial capabilities. So I think a lot remains to be seen on exactly how this all plays out. And I think it all comes down at the end of the day to what President Trump says when he's in the room with Albanese and makes the decision. Because really, at the moment, all attention is on the Middle East. There's not much to really be said for the Asia Pacific, and I'm sure that will come up later.
And as you say, even if Australia did want to really knuckle down and increase defence spending, it is more of a long-term goal, right? Mid-2030s, that's 10 years away. These aren't quick fixes, any of the plan Bs that they may be considering. Ben, how are the other US allies in the Asia-Pacific region feeling about all this?
Well, the thing is that even if the Trump administration isn't a big fan of AUKUS, it's clear that a lot of people across the Indo-Pacific are big fans. New Zealand's Conservative government has been looking at the potential to join the second pillar of AUKUS for a while. And that second pillar of AUKUS, that's the one that talks a lot about advanced tech capabilities. So while the first pillar is the nuclear submarines, and no one is getting involved in that apart from Australia, the UK and the US, the second pillar is far more sort of broad, and it's about Australia, the UK and the US working together on capabilities that are going to be necessary for the next generation of security, things like artificial intelligence, quantum computing and advanced weaponry. Now, that particular pillar is open to other allies to take part in. And in particular, they're looking at, as I said, New Zealand has voiced its interest. Japan has also been very clear it's keen to be a part of that pillar. And so has South Korea. So these are major US allies in the region, all of whom would be very keen to be part of that AUKUS. So even if the Trump administration pulls back, that doesn't necessarily mean that AUKUS would be dead, at least not entirely. There could still be a sort of coalition coming together to work on that second part of AUKUS.
And we would need a different acronym, wouldn't we? Ben, final question. Given what we know about who called the review, what is at stake for Australia, not to mention the 500 million Aussie dollars we've already slapped down on the counter for AUKUS, the lack of a plan B, or rather the complexity that would be required to make a pivot, what should we be watching over the next few weeks in relation to AUKUS?
I suspect that we will now see a concerted push by the Australian government to get a new meeting or potentially a call between Australian Prime Minister Albanese and Trump, because I think just the longer that they don't have a face-to-face meeting or at least a phone call on AUKUS, the longer that uncertainty around exactly what the US president thinks about this security pact will continue to linger and sort of undermine support for the program. I think there's two parts to this. That's the first part, this idea that, this refusal to have a meeting at the G7 due to the need for Trump to leave will just continue to fuel anxiety in Australia over how committed Trump actually is to AUKUS. But even if the two leaders have a meeting in a week or in 2 weeks or in a month, and they come out with plenty of backslapping and, everyone's wearing AUKUS caps, it won't hide the fact that there are going to be huge questions asked all the way through this program until the early 2030s when, everything working out, the first Virginia-class sub rolls into Western Australia or into the new military base somewhere on the East Coast. And whoever's the Prime Minister then slaps a bottle of champagne against it. Because there are big questions over whether or not the US can even build these submarines, let alone whether or not they would want to sell them to Australia. It has all the critics, including former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull, keen to point out, the US president has the final say over whether or not Australia gets these submarines. So we could get to 2032, it's time. The president of the day, whoever that is, looks at this deal and says, we can't spare them, and Australia doesn't get their submarines. And then where are we?
Ben Westcott, thank you, and good luck for the new gig.
Thanks very much, Beck.
If you found today's conversation insightful, be sure to follow the Bloomberg Australia podcast wherever you listen and check in for more reading on AUKUS, the Asia Pacific, and the latest reporting from Ben Westcott on Bloomberg.com. This episode was recorded on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri and Ngunnawal people. It was produced by Paul Allen and edited by Chris Burke and Ainsley Chandler. I'm Rebecca Jones, and I'll see you next week.